Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming back for this follow-up episode. We had so many questions on our last webinar with Mabel Fulford, Director of Innovation at Peak Power, that we've corralled her and brought her back to go through some of those unanswered questions. And joining us on this revisit are some of the key members of our webinar committee. Some you may know, some you may not know. So what I'm going to ask is that very quickly we go through each person and just give a quick intro for yourself, please. Maybe starting, I'm going to go in the order I see the faces. So Jason.
Hello everyone, I'm Jason Arnaud. I'm a member of the EV Society and I've been driving electric for about 7 years now. I'm currently the chapter lead for our Scarborough EV Society chapter.
Thanks, Jason. Anise?
Hello, everyone. I'm Anise Sharifi, part of the Mississauga chapter. I've been part of EV Society for over 4 years, proud EV owner for over 4 years, and yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah, and she's being modest because Anise is also in the role right now as Vice President of EV Society. So she has a lot on her plate these days. But Mabel, thanks for coming back. And what we've decided to do here is just go through some of these unanswered questions, and each of us on the committee will take a shot at reading out the question. And Mabel will be in the hot seat to answer them. And I didn't make this list up, but somehow I got to be the first person to ask a question. And the first unanswered question came from Calvin. And the question is, how can I sign up to Peak Power's V2H pilot project?
So we shared a link in the previous webinar, and I'm happy to provide it to you, Tim, to share more broadly. There's a page on our website where you can sign up to our waitlist, and that V2H survey also is applicable if you aren't able to participate in our current pilot project. We'd still love to hear from you. It really helps us to provide an indication of interest in V2H pilot projects as we're shaping the future of our program, and we'd love to hear from you if you're interested.
So there's no expiry date, even if somebody's watching this recording a month from now, they'd still be welcome to click on the link and participate.
Absolutely. Our enrollment for our current Ontario pilot is still open at the moment. It will be closing at some point in the next few months, but we still would love to hear from you as we look at future pilot projects.
Great, thank you. Jason.
Hi Mabel, this one is a question from Sarah and it's multi-part, so I'll go a bit at a time. Can you explain in more detail what's happening in your pilot project system diagram? What's charging those cars?
So basically, the way that the system would be laid out for our current pilot project, which is kind of the simplest use case for home bidirectional charging, the charger will be set up really very similarly to a normal home charger. It would be connected to your home electricity panel. And when you're using it for regular charging, it would be charging through your home from the grid. When it's in a bidirectional mode, basically the way it works is it would feed power back first to your home and basically would have the effect of reducing the electricity consumption that your home is drawing from the grid. Another question that we got in a few places was about net metering. At the moment, net metering is not allowed everywhere in Ontario. There are a few pilots on net metering, but generally that's more complicated. So for our current project, we won't be doing an export to the grid, but in future that will be allowed as well. So that, if your home is using less than your car is outputting, it could then feed actually the other way through your home electricity meter onto the grid, similar to the way that renewables work. And there will also be in this system a transfer switch, basically the part of it that acts like a backup generator and detects when the grid goes offline And then it would switch over to allow the car to power the home directly when the power is out. And then also recognize when the power is back on, would allow your home to switch back over.
Great, thank you. So it sounds like for this project, at least, the bidirectional charging will allow your home use or the power that your home is pulling from the grid to drop to 0, but not feed power back into the grid. It'll go to 0, but that's about it. You won't be making money off the grid.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So in the future, there's all sorts of potential, and you know, in different places in Canada, they have different metering setups, but that's how it would work currently. And so they'll you know, be kind of a matching piece of that to look at, you know, what within your home do you want to be fed from your vehicle.
Okay, great. And the last part of that question is, what sort of kilowatt or kilowatt hour draw is expected for an at-home bidirectional EV?
So current kind of home bidirectional chargers are in a similar range as you'd see from a typical level 2 home charger, but in this case it would be DC. So that's, you know, 5 to 10 kilowatts. In terms of the actual energy stored, and so from a kilowatt perspective, that would easily double a home's peak load. So most of the time, most people's homes would be consuming less than 7 kilowatts. You can see immediately why bidirectional could have huge consequences, both from a challenge perspective for the grid, because obviously we can't plan our systems with huge safety factors, assuming, you know, they could all turn on at the same time. And that in reality, that's not how, you know, aggregated EV load works. But, you know, that's a big concern for grid operators to manage. We don't want to see home demands doubling as EV chargers plug in. It's also a huge opportunity to look at the scale of a car battery compared to a home's typical consumption. So from an energy perspective, as an example, current Nissan Leaf contains 60 kilowatt hours, and that would keep a home going for about 3 days on average. In the Ford electric F-150s marketing with their Vita H system, they say that can keep a house going for 3 days, and it can keep going for up to 10 days if you sort of conserve your power use. So it's really material when you start looking at you know, the amount of power that a home actually needs and the amount of power and energy that's stored within your car battery.
Great, thank you. Lisa?
Okay. Can you speak about future potential advances in battery storage and home energy systems for EVs and for non-EVs? And like, for example, will homes have their own battery systems so EVs can charge them as well? And for generators, can EVs themselves power them and their batteries? And again, for example, like major power outages, such as experienced a few weeks ago in Ontario.
Absolutely. So for our current pilot, as I mentioned, we're just going to be looking at the bidirectional charger and vehicle and the home. But there are huge opportunities to combine that with other systems to increase the benefits that you'd see from it. So for example, you know, if that system is going to allow you to go for 3 days without power, if you combine that with some solar panels, those solar panels can recharge your car battery and provide that backup and resiliency piece for much longer. It also can tie into, for example, a home energy system, a home energy battery. The amount of power in or energy stored in the vehicle is actually much larger than most home battery systems are currently. But of course, you're not at home all of the time. And so there certainly could be a potential combination that when you're away from home, perhaps you're relying on that smaller battery, and then you can then balance it out with your car battery when you return home. And there is, I think, lots of potential for this system, even in those longer power outages. For example, typically these systems will build in some thresholds to make sure that the car battery never goes below a particular state of charge. If you wanted to be able to, run an errand or for emergencies. But that also means when areas have long sustained power outages, that your system can say, hey, getting low on power, and it's a mobile battery. So you could drive to an area that does have grid connectivity or a community hub location that can provide generation or power, charge up, and then go back home. And so it provides so many ways that can be optimized, both for the backup power perspective. And the same concept basically applies to the grid as a whole, that if you expand the group of homes or region that's using this battery storage, you start being able to do really interesting things to optimize all of the local distributed power sources that we have access to.
Great. I guess that's me now. So Joe writes, I think this is a question sort of revealing his future wishes. So he asks, with energy density increasing at around 10% a year, cheap used EV battery home energy banks will soon be available in passively designed homes, and advances in the solar panel technology. So why not disconnect entirely from the grid in the future?
So I would certainly agree that it's becoming easier and more cost effective for certain homeowners to disconnect from the grid entirely. But I am really hopeful that our policy and regulatory systems will be able to take advantage of the fact that some homeowners are going to be able to do this, and in fact could actually become net exporters of power. But not everybody can. It's much more difficult to do this if you live in an apartment in downtown Toronto, for example. And so that's a big piece of why regulators, utilities, and folks who are making energy policy are really interested in studying these technologies to look at how can we harness the benefits of that at a community or at a regional level, so that we can aggregate all the resources that everybody has access to, and, for example, remunerate somebody who is able to go off grid. And it is much more cost effective and efficient from a system perspective overall to make use of the various resources we have. But I think I would also say that without question, we're certainly seeing a trend towards more local sort of self-reliability and emergency planning, to say we still want the benefits of a shared grid, and we still want the benefits of accessing resources across a big region, but also with a strong element of making sure a local community has the ability to provide that reliability.
Thank you. Jason.
Next question is from Gordon. How do you see the incredibly strict grid reliability standards being met by the electrical system operators when they utilize individual owners' EVs via V2G?
So that actually ties in quite nicely with the previous question. And this is really a huge focus of our current pilot project in partnership with Hydro One and with financial support from the Ontario Independent Electricity System Operators Grid Innovation Fund, is to really look at collecting the hard data on both at a technical level, looking at performance and reliability and cost effectiveness, to say, if we compare an individual EV owner or a bidirectional V2H system, how does that compare to other generation sources or demand response resources on the grid? So how does it measure up? How can it be metered and measured? For example, if individuals are going to be remunerated for providing that value to the grid, how are we going to measure it? Because it doesn't make sense for every homeowner to have the same extremely expensive metering setup that a large central generation plant would have. And so that's going to be a really big piece, and that's a large piece of why pilot projects are so important, is that it allows the data collection and allows these systems to be put side by side with other resources on the grid. And also, we'd expect a big component to come at that aggregated level. For one individual driver, it's impossible to predict. Perhaps they go for groceries one day, or that there's a level of uncertainty and unpredictability. But at a macro level, there's actually a lot of very consistent behavior, so we can do modeling and make some assumptions about how many EVs will be available and connected to the grid at any one point in time.
Okay, so this combination of questions is from Stephen and John, who I think know each other. Okay, so the questions are, what chargers are you using for your pilot project, and can anyone else get one? That's the first question. The second part is, are ISO 15118-20 chargers bidirectional? And then the last part of the question is, what V2G chargers are available in Canada and how much are they?
So the charger for our pilot project is actually still TBD at the moment, because right now in Canada, there are no certified residential bidirectional chargers available. There are several chargers kind of working their way through the certification process in the US, which would then be able to shortly be available in Canada as well. But it's certainly the main gating step right now is that charger availability and, of course, the EV compatibility. So right now, the answer is unfortunately no. People in Canada can't go to the shop and buy a bidirectional charger. And I would expect, my best guess is that that will become possible in the next 1 to 2 years approximately. The standard ISO 15118-20 is a really good one to mention. I appreciate that question from the participant. This is actually an international communications standard, and it incorporates various elements that would be required to enable bidirectional activities. So basically, it allows software such as peak power software to talk to the charger, to collect information and to send signals to say, commence bidirectional charging. Unfortunately, today, that's a little bit ahead of the hardware. And so, for example, with AC charging, the latest OCPP protocols, for example, are sort of future compatible with bidirectional charging, but there are no vehicles that actually enable that AC kind of typical level 2 charging right now. But these standards are great to see them coming to fruition, because it means that when the hardware and the vehicles come to market, there will be some element of backwards compatibility there. So for example, the ability to do over-the-air updates, but it's always worth checking. When a charger says it's bidirectional capable or bidirectional enabled, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can use it for bidirectional power flow today. In Canada, I talked about residential chargers. There are actually commercial chargers available. So for example, DC fast chargers. So that's what you see for most of the current pilot projects in Canada today, including the one in the photograph behind me, which is Peak Power's Peak Drive project. So that's in downtown commercial buildings in Toronto. So those are faster rates of discharge, and unfortunately, they're not possible to install in a home today because of the different electrical system. Oh, and the last part of that question is how much are they? Right now, it's unknown because most of the technologies are in pilot phase. We're expecting that home bidirectional chargers will probably be around twice as much as a regular level 2 home charger. Perhaps not the very first one, but pretty soon. And those costs should come down over time because the actual components involved in the technology are not all that expensive. But certainly at the beginning, there definitely is going to be an incremental cost involved compared to a standard one-directional charger. Interestingly, the Ford F-150 system actually comes out of the box. It comes with one of Ford's kind of standard packages for the vehicle. So I'm sure we'll see a bunch of different kind of pricing strategies evolve.
Great. Well, that kind of leads into the next question. And I think this came up from a number of the folks that watched the webinar. It's asking you to try and sort of differentiate the bidirectional capabilities of some of the vehicles that we see on the market. The Leaf, for example, that you're working with, the Ford F-150 that you just referenced, and also the Hyundai Ioniq 5, which has bidirectional capability. So, you know, what are those capabilities and what are the differences between vehicles?
So the Nissan Leaf has been bidirectional for actually quite a few years. They were the first mass market vehicle in the game. It's been in use in Japan since 2011. And that's largely because the CHAdeMO charging standard, which the Nissan Leaf uses, incorporated bidirectional charging right from the beginning. And so, so those vehicles are bidirectional today. Unfortunately, there's no certified charger available in North America right now. But once chargers become available, those vehicles will be fully bidirectional enabled. The Ford electric F-150 is the new kid on the block. It's really exciting and likely to come to market soon. And they're using, the full details aren't available yet, but they're using their own proprietary system specific to the Ford F-150, and it's using the CCS charging standard. And the CCS standard is the most common DC charging method that's used in North America. Most vehicles are compatible with CCS. The CCS standard itself doesn't actually incorporate bidirectional charging yet, but similar to what Ford has done, it is possible to have a CCS charger that is also bidirectional. But certainly, we're definitely looking forward to the updates of the standard, because it will mean that it will be much easier to have non-proprietary kind of interoperable bidirectional charging with CCS. The Hyundai is another one definitely worth mentioning, and there are a couple other models coming to market that enable what's called V2L, vehicle to load. So that doesn't enable full bidirectional charging capabilities right now in the way that I've described, you know, for example, connecting to your electricity panel and powering your home directly and contributing to the grid. But it does enable, basically think of it as you can plug something into your vehicle. And there are a few models now that enable this, and that does mean that you can use your car in certain capacities in a blackout, for example, or if you're going camping, or if you're using tools outside. And so that does, and that's likely going to be possible sooner for a larger number of people to provide a little piece of that puzzle that we're looking forward to once bidirectional full capabilities become more widely available.
So I'm just curious now, because does that mean that there's an added cost to have the full capability of bidirectional, and that's why people are sort of treading lightly into it? Or is there some reason why they just don't enable all the capabilities right out of the box?
It's a little bit of a mixture, and not necessarily purely driven by cost, but with vehicle to load, for example, an EV manufacturer has much more control over all of the pieces. There's no need to have a compatible charger. There's no need to tie into an external system. It can, the manufacturer, it's kind of a full out of the box system. There's also an interesting debate, or kind of a few potential directions in the industry regarding AC and DC bidirectional charging. Basically, the difference being that for AC charging, and to enable this bidirectional charging, an inverter has to be involved at some point in the chain, similar to if you had, a solar system or a wind turbine at your house. So far, that has sat within the charger, kind of external to the vehicle, using the vehicle's DC charging port. There's a possibility in the future that manufacturers might enable AC charging by putting an inverter on board the vehicle itself. And there are pros and cons to that, including, obviously it adds weight, it adds cost to the vehicle. It also opens up a big can of worms for the grid interconnectivity and safety certification, because it would be like your vehicle now has to be treated like a home appliance and follow all of those safety certifications, which are totally different than, the regular bodies and standards that govern vehicles. So right now that doesn't exist. It's kind of under trials, and it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out, because in that scenario, you wouldn't actually need a special charger equipment in order to do bidirectional charging with your vehicle.
Thank you.
Staying on that topic, Jack asks, Ford says their F-150 EV can power a home for up to 10 days. If I buy an F-150, can I do V2H in Ontario today? And if not, what barriers need to be removed to make that possible?
So I'll start with a caveat that, we haven't seen the F-150 system yet. We don't know the full details, but based on what they have released, the answer is a cautious and conditional yes. In theory, yes, the system is going to enable you to power your home. There is a utility safety considerations and a sort of interconnection process. So you would need to check with your local utility to see what the requirements would be. But in theory, the technology is all available, and most regions have an existing process that would enable you to do such a system. I would also say that if you call your electric utility, you might be the first person to do so, which usually means it's going to be a little bit more of a complicated process. But that's exactly what our goal is in running our pilot program, is to go through all of those steps, identify the kinks in the process, identify, where can we use existing processes and safety certifications and kind of pro formas, and what's novel for V2H. Where do we need to smooth out that customer experience and customer journey to enable this to happen? But yeah, and if you have an F-150 with V2H, again, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear how it shapes out and to help with that process.
Okay. Next question is from Glenn. Are your programs impacted by the politics of the government of the day? Has the Ontario or federal government indicated interest support for V2G or V2H?
So I would say absolutely yes. Where the technology is at the moment is very much in that pilot project stage. And so government support and funding is really critical to enable it to kind of take that jump from, it's been tested in the lab, we know that the equipment works, to actually deploy it in, the real world situation and see how it works on the ground. And I would also say that in addition to funding, government has a really important role to play to coordinate all the stakeholders involved. Because in order to make bidirectional charging happen, you've got to have the utility involved, you've got to have the vehicle manufacturer, the charging manufacturer, all of the safety certification bodies, standards bodies, and individual consumers all rowing in the same direction. And so government programs can play a really big role in terms of issuing those signals to say there's support for this technology, that's going to be a market for it, and to coordinate everybody together. I would also say that public opinion and media actually also plays a really big role. And we've seen that there's a huge amount of public interest in bidirectional charging. And also in recent times in North America, it's really jumped up the kind of priority radar from a policy perspective and a public interest perspective, in large part because we know about the benefits to the grid and kind of that theoretical aspect of the virtual power plant concept of allowing everybody to pool together and compete against power plants to support our electricity grid. But the reliability and backup power aspect has really come to the forefront, especially in the wake of huge power outages in California in the wake of forest fires, and in Texas due to extreme weather temperatures. And interestingly, in kind of the climate change policy journey, we've really seen that those kind of high impact events that make world headlines and that really impact people, people, it's a shared lived experience, can make a really big difference in accelerating climate change policy. So one example is in the wake of Hurricane Sandy in New York and New York State became one of the leaders in North America for distributed energy systems and using batteries to support the grid, using those lessons learned. And so I think there's really a big critical mass right now to support this technology and figure out how do we get it from where it is now to, being able so that an individual can buy it off the shelf and put it in their home.
Okay, me again. Next question from Raymond. Are there any efforts underway to mandate V2X capabilities in all future EVs through regulation?
So I think that's an interesting corollary to kind of it's the carrot and stick approach. Right now we've seen mainly the carrot, funding programs, support for working groups, and sort of stakeholder consultations. It's certainly been a topic of discussion. Should V2X sort of vehicle to everything technologies be mandated? How and when? I think where we are right now, we don't have the enough standards and technology available yet to say this should be mandatory in such and such scenarios. But we certainly have enough information to show us that there's a huge opportunity here, and to a large extent a missed opportunity, that if we've got a huge amount of public funding dollars being invested to allow us to electrify our transportation, and it's a big missed opportunity if that all goes in as one directional infrastructure and we have to wait until next time we replace those charges to take advantage of bidirectional. And so I think there's definitely a lot of recognition and support for looking at how can government or in general, how can we encourage the adoption of bidirectional technology and the interoperability of bidirectional technology between chargers and EVs without picking those technology winners and without going too fast, too soon and creating those unintended consequences.
All right, so Jeff wants to know about the expected effect on battery longevity if one is using V2G?
So that's a really interesting question. And it depends in large part on what type of V2G is being used. So the use case that we've used in our Peak Drive project and that we're focusing on for our new pilot project is a relatively smaller number of deep discharges. So for example, on occasion, discharging the EV to, for example, reduce peak demand on the grid or to power your home during a blackout. Battery degradation is a really complex question. It requires a whole lot of data, but sort of the general view and Nissan's view on it is that it's really quite similar to, let's say, highway driving. As if you went on if you did a deep discharge, it would be like you went on a highway trip, then you plugged into a fast charger on the highway to top your battery back up again. There are other ways of using V2G. So for example, a lot of the European pilot studies used it for what's called frequency regulation. So what that looks like is a high number of shallow discharges to help kind of the regulation of the grid on a really short-term basis, just to keep everything level. So that means it doesn't have a huge impact on the state of charge of your vehicle. So, you don't lose sort of the energy stored, but it happens much more frequently. And so that can have an impact on battery degradation. There are a number of studies out there looking at, the economics and the pros/cons. But certainly it's more of a consideration for that type of use case than it is for, if we're talking about using it on occasion and in a blackout. But it's certainly, I think, something that can be really interesting as we see the scale of use of bidirectional charging pick up, and we start seeing much larger volumes of data to inform that question of, in an ideal case, what we'd love to be able to do is to say, if you're supporting the grid, for example, and participating in a virtual power plant, we'd love to say you're going to get $20 for participating in this event, and it's going to cost you $2 from battery degradation, and have each person be able to actually make that decision. Is that a trade-off? Those numbers are completely random and are not necessarily proportional, but that's certainly where we love to get to eventually, is to be able to quantify it so that people can make decisions about how they want to prioritize their battery life versus other uses.
Yeah, and they'll probably want to ask the auto manufacturer involved what their thoughts are in terms of the car's warranty when it's being used in this way.
Absolutely, and that's a large part of the reason of why, because there's no standards right now. That's a big part of the reason of why each EV manufacturer has their own custom process for certification of of bidirectional chargers, and as you say, it's really important before you start bidirectional charging to check your vehicle warranty, because even if the charger is available and follows all the safety certifications, it doesn't mean that the EV manufacturer has certified it for that vehicle, and it may impact the warranty. And that's a big aspect of, they want to make sure they've done all of that testing before telling their consumers, yes, this is safe to use this charger, it will be fine with your battery and your vehicle.
Look forward to the day when it's a competitive issue and manufacturers of cars will want to be able to offer that upfront as a great feature to their vehicle that perhaps other vehicles don't offer. Jason.
Terry asks, I live in a small village north of Toronto and was very excited about adding solar panels and taking advantage of net metering. However, Hydro One says that the infrastructure in this community doesn't support this option. Does this mean V2H won't work for me either? What options might be available instead?
So this ties together quite a few topics we've covered, which is great. I would start by saying I can't speak to the specifics of the network in this particular area and what the barriers might be, but certainly net metering is not possible everywhere in Ontario right now. That regulation is actually being studied to look at, does it make sense to roll out more broadly? But in the meantime, there are other options, as I mentioned. For example, cars that have vehicle to load capability, sort of separate from your home electricity system, could be used to provide certain backup power capabilities. So again, I can't speak to the specifics of this particular application, but your utility may be able to help you, or you can contact an electrician, for example, someone you might go to look at installing a backup generator at your house, and see if they can propose some options for you.
So in theory, the next question from Mike is one that came up in a straw poll we did on a webinar not too long ago about will bidirectional allow one vehicle to charge another vehicle?
Yeah, so that was an interesting one, and it was really interesting to see that feedback and that come up as the kind of the top ranked use case of interest in that previous webinar. Most of our conversations, at least, have focused on the value to the grid and the backup power use case of bidirectional power. In theory, this is possible. It is already possible to basically use an EV to jumpstart. For example, like a regular vehicle, if your 12-volt battery goes down, it's possible for an EV to jumpstart another car. Right now, the interoperability is going to be the biggest challenge because each car has a different type of plug, a different type of charging protocol. And so it's going to be interesting to see if this feedback comes through and we see the technology evolving for this. But it certainly in theory would be possible. And it's also something that we're going to take back into our discussions with industry stakeholders and manufacturers to say, hey, we got a really high amount of interest in this. Is this something that's on the radar? Just
have to be careful not to plug your 800-volt vehicle into a 400-volt vehicle, unless you want a really fast charge, right? It could be a disaster. Yeah. Okay, I think Jason, you want to go to your last question there? We've lost Anise, so we can jump to the last question here.
Okay, last question is from Stephen. I see at McMaster University there's a leaf plugged into a V2G charger on the main campus quite often. Is Peak Power working with McMaster on their V2G research?
We actually haven't worked with McMaster directly to date, but I certainly would say I encourage anyone who is participating or running a bidirectional pilot program to reach out to us. We're really keen supporters of knowledge sharing and collaboration. And certainly we're happy to share our learnings from our pilot programs as well. Thanks, Stephen, for mentioning McMaster. I'll definitely reach out and see how that program's been going recently. And there are actually, the other thing I would say, there are beginning to see pilot projects popping up across the country. For example, Nova Scotia Power has launched a fairly large pilot program. Hydro-Quebec has done some testing of bidirectional systems. So, definitely keep your eyes peeled. I'm sure we'll start seeing more and more of these programs pop up across the country.
Terrific. Well, thanks very much, Mabel, for coming back on and cleaning up all these questions. I think this, I'm going to label this one a little more technical. So I think some folks in the general population might not be able to absorb or get a lot out of it. they will get something out of it. But I know our diehard attendees will love this this broadcast. So, and thank you, Jason. Thank you, Anise, wherever you are, and also Chris, who's hiding behind the curtain. Appreciate all your help in putting this together, and Mabel, best of luck. Hopefully we can get you back sometime in the future, and we'll do a follow-up to see how we're doing in the world of bidirectional charging.
I would love to. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks Tim and the full EV Society team.
Thanks a lot. So we'll end it here. Thanks, folks.
Thank you. Have a great night.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.